Look, there's some processes that need to happen.
Tonight, Ottawa's new Crown-Indigenous Relations Minister searches for answers on the Winnipeg landfill issue.
For all of us who were present to have unknowingly recognized this individual was a terrible mistake.
Plus, the Prime Minister says sorry for a Nazi soldier's presence in the House of Commons. Good evening, Tansei Anin. Welcome to APTN National News. I'm Daryl Stranger. The first search for unmarked graves at a former school site in the Yukon took place earlier this summer. As with other searches across the country, officials there say they found a number of anomalies. Our reporter Sarah Connors has those details, and viewer discretion is advised, as some might find the story disturbing.
And we acknowledge the immense sorrow and grief that this information has brought to you and your communities.
Families who have gone decades without knowing what happened to their missing children are one step closer to getting answers. Earlier this summer, survey company Geoscan was hired to conduct a search of the former Chutla Indian Residential School in Carcross, Yukon. Geoscan says it's identified 15 anomalies, indicating potential unmarked grave sites.
This is going to go for some time, help a lot of people. They now have the answers, which is really important.
Geoscan covered more than 37,000 square meters with ground-penetrating radar this summer. It located the 15 anomalies within a 58 square meter area.
So everything that we see kind of hangs together in terms of a story of these being treated seriously as burials.
Multiple schools operated at the Chutla site between 1903 to 1969. 20 students are known to have died there. But researchers say archival records show that 33 deaths occurred at Chutla.
There are still children whose names we do not know. Children whose cause of death we do not know. And we do not know where the majority of these children have been buried.
Researchers are hoping to gain access to more records to help uncover additional information. For some, it's almost a foregone conclusion.
We need the truth, and we found it. It's here with us today.
More searches will take place at other former residential schools across the territory in future years. Sarah Connors, APTN National News, Whitehorse.
The National Indian Residential School Crisis Line is available for survivors and others who might need support. That number is 1-866-925-4419. Well, with September 30th coming up, many Indigenous people are assessing the impact of the Pope's apology. Amongst them, a TwoSpirit Elder in Winnipeg. Sab Jones has more.
TwoSpirit Elder, Albert McLeod, believes that the Pope's apology for the Catholic Church's role in residential schools wasn't inclusive of Two-Spirit people.
The apology was very specific around heteronormative or straight people. Two-Spirit people were not a part of that negotiating with the Vatican. The terms of that apology, that would have included Two-Spirit or Indigenous LGBTQ people. It was very much about the binary, right? Even though in those schools, in day schools, there was Two-Spirit people, there was Two-Spirit students.
According to McLeod, Two-Spirit people have been left out of the conversation.
So I think in Canada's negotiation with, AFN, Métis National Council, MMF, Inuit Tipiriat Kanatami, they left us out of that process. So itself, it was flawed. And again, it shows that our leadership falls back on the binary, falls back on colonialism, and doesn't see an alternative. And so we were excluded from that apology. So I think now it behooves Canada and these national organizations to make space for us to have conversations.
McLeod says the National Centre for Truth and Reconciliation has more work to do.
Let's tell the core truth of what those schools were and what they did to Indigenous psychology and thoughts, right? Psyches, that allowed homophobia and transphobia to persist. And so I see a lot of privilege ownership happening from heterosexual people working in those systems who want to maintain their power and access, and they don't want to share it with Two-Spirit people. So we managed to get one Two-Spirit Indian residential school survivor on the survivor circle, but we need more Two-Spirit people involved in the National Center for Truth and Reconciliation.
Sav Jonesa, APTN National News, Winnipeg.
A Quebec Superior Court judge recently dismissed an emergency application by the Mohawk mothers to stop drilling and excavation in a specific area of the redevelopment project at the site of the old Royal Victoria Hospital in Montreal. During the hearing, the Mohawk mothers said that they had significant concerns with the way the archaeological investigation was being handled. Marymus Culbertson has more.
After Quebec Superior Court Justice Gregory Moore dismissed the motion to stop excavation in Zone 11, the Mohawk mothers, Organisten Sera, said they will be back in court at the end of October to address multiple issues. They allege McGill is in breach of a court-approved settlement agreement that was reached back in April.
The defendants seem to think and are putting out there that there was no human remains found and that's the end of it, but that's simply not so.
Judge Moore ruled that the Mohawk mothers did not demonstrate that drilling Zone 11 would cause irreparable harm in the search for unmarked graves near the site of the old Royal Vic Hospital.
This investigation is evolving and it's constantly having new information, and that needs to be a factor within this investigation, that there are other things that need to be going on and being viewed and being scrutinized, and the results need to be analyzed by professionals that are put in place, such as our panel that we have.
The judgment also stated that the panel of archaeologists selected by the Mohawk mothers in accordance with the April settlement agreement reported that it was impossible that there would be unmarked graves in Zone 11 because the area in question was a road built on bedrock that has likely been paved since at least 1949.
That is a concern of ours, that they unilaterally made the decision that the panel is no more. And that's their interpretation of what the settlement agreement says.
In August, project developers McGill University and Quebec's Infrastructure Society, or SQI, terminated the mandate of the archaeologist panel. Julian Falconer, who represents the Office of the Independent Special Interlocutor for Missing Children and Unmarked Graves, was also at the hearing.
Talk about a crisis of confidence. And so that's why we're stuck. I think it's a shame. I think McGill's taken a lot of goodwill that was there as a result of the settlement agreement and really compromised it. And so we're looking for guidance from the court on October 27th.
In an email sent to its student body and staff, McGill said activities at the site, including the deployment of archaeological techniques, would continue to be carried out as per the settlement agreement. When contacted by APTN News, the university referred back to that statement.
I already tendered the evidence from Dr. Burke, one of the panel members, in a communication directly to the Société Québécoise, the agency, SQI and McGill, he says specifically, you're not following my recommendations and you're not following best practices.
Marymus Culbertson, APTN National News, Montreal.
Well, we want to hear what you think about the stories you have seen so far tonight. Here's how to continue the conversation. To read and watch our stories, go to aptnnews.ca. If you have a story you want to share, send us an email to news@aptn.ca. You can find us online on your favorite social media sites, including TikTok, YouTube, LinkedIn, and X, previously known as Twitter. Follow APTN News to join the conversation and see our latest stories. Pressure continues to mount on the Trudeau government to fund the search of a Winnipeg landfill where it is believed the remains of 2 Indigenous women are located. Voters in Manitoba go to the polls in a provincial election on October the 3rd. The Progressive Conservatives have campaigned on a refusal to fund a search of the Prairie Green landfill, while the NDP says it would move forward on a search if elected. When asked Wednesday what role the federal government would play, Crown-Indigenous Relations Minister Gary Anandasangari was non-committal.
Look, there's some processes that need to happen. One of them is additional information that's required. So the feasibility study outlined some concerns about biohazard, for example. So we have, with the Long Plain as well as the AMC, we are looking to see what other types of information is required.
All right, we need to step aside for just a moment. Still plenty more news to come, so don't go anywhere. Welcome back to APTN National News. The president of Canada's National Inuit Organization had some explaining to do after he participated in a standing ovation for a World War II veteran close to him. That veteran turned out not to be what or who he expected. Trevor Wright has more.
Last Friday, the House of Commons, during a visit from the President of Ukraine, Volodymyr Zelensky, the House cheered on Yaroslav Hunka. Hunka was described by Speaker Anthony Rota as a Ukrainian freedom fighter during World War II. Turns out, Hunka fought for Nazi Germany with the infamous Waffen-SS. Situated close to Hunka was Natan Obed, president of Inuit Tapmarit Kanatami. Like everyone else in the House of Commons, Obed got up and cheered when the Speaker rose to applaud the World War II veteran. In the aftermath of Speaker Rota's faux pas and subsequent resignation from the Speaker's chair, Obed released a brief statement on September 25, saying, like everyone else that day, he didn't know Hunka was a Nazi. Obed declined to comment any further. Obed in his statement said, "I have worked my entire life to call out racism in all its forms, and am extremely disappointed that this individual was seated in the gallery for this event. I accept Speaker Anthony Rota's apology and have asked the federal government to ensure this never happens again." Rota's last day as Speaker of the House was today. Prime Minister Justin Trudeau apologized to the House today as well. Trevor Wright, APTN National News, Ottawa.
Well, as Trevor just mentioned, the Prime Minister offered up an apology today for a moment that has caused international embarrassment. Here's more from the Prime Minister.
On behalf of all of us in this House, I would like to present unreserved apologies for what took place on Friday, and to President Zelensky and the Ukrainian delegation for the position they were put in. For all of us who were present to have unknowingly recognized this individual was a terrible mistake and a violation of the memory of those who suffered grievously at the hands of the Nazi regime.
The third annual National Day for Truth and Reconciliation is this Saturday. APTN National News is taking a look back at the past years since the Pope's apology. Potential unmarked graves continue to be found at residential school sites across the country, and various governments have committed to meeting reconciliation needs. Joining us now is Treaty Commissioner of Saskatchewan, Marymus Culbertson, for her views on reconciliation efforts. Well, Mary, thank you so much for joining us here today. My first question for you, in your opinion, what has changed for Indigenous people and especially residential school survivors since the Pope's apology last year?
I think that there's varied feelings since the Pope's apology. There was, of course, many people who were ecstatic. It was a part of closure for them. There was people who were indifferent, and people who were absolutely angry. If anything has changed, on a big scale, a larger scale that you can see, I don't think there has been a lot of change. I mean, he came here, he fulfilled a request to come and do apologies in person. The Catholic Church has repudiated the doctrine of discovery, but that does not mean that they have revoked it. He has said very left of center comments for an institution that is traditionally very right But I mean, in terms of a change on the ground, there's no change. There's no change when you still have discoveries being made, when you still have the Catholic Church blocking access to records in any way they can, when you have denialism running rampant through this country every time there's a discovery.
Well, just on that note there, Mary, recently 93 unmarked graves were identified at the Beauval Indian Residential School site. And in response, you mentioned deniers often try to disprove this reality to show nothing was done wrong. What effect does this denial have on survivors?
Denying that these atrocities took place is basically denying all of the residential school system was a vehicle of assimilation. If we denied the Holocaust as Indigenous people and were anti-Semitic, that's a criminal code violation. If we were actively displaying hate phrases, inciting hatred, committing hate crimes, those are criminal offenses. But society, people in society, governments even, can do this to Indigenous people, and there is no recourse. We have no place to go. We can go to the UN and say, this has been happening, this has been happening, this has been happening. But where's the recourse for Canada? There is no sanctions. So it's the people on the ground who have to keep making those changes, regardless of what governments around us do, whether it's a provincial government, whether it's a federal government, whether it's a local government. It's the people on the ground who will keep making those steps going forward in reconciliation, and they will keep being the champions for change. And the denialism has, of course, it makes you angry. It's deplorable. And it's a way to discredit the voices of First Nations people again and again and again, to always call us liars, to say we're not telling the truth. You could tell them, everything that they need to hear to prove something, but it is their choice to not believe it. And we have graves of infant-sized graves. People need to be asking those questions of themselves. Why is there babies, infants buried outside of a Catholic cemetery where a residential school sat?
Yeah. And Mary, you've been also very vocal about your opposition to the Saskatchewan First Act that was introduced last November, an act that asserts exclusive provincial jurisdiction over natural resources in the province. How does this act fall in or out of line with reconciliation efforts?
Well, the act falling in or out of line for reconciliation efforts, I mean, it's two governments basically, the provincial government asserting their jurisdiction, which they believe is theirs, to the federal government. However, that jurisdiction that the federal government handed that provincial body when it was created after 1905, so after the treaties were entered into here, was an unlawful authority for theirs to give. So transferring of the NRTA, which was the creation of the Natural Resources Transfer Agreement, transfer the delegated authority of those resources to Western Canadian provinces should not have been done. The federal crown at the time had no authority to do so. It was a complete breach of treaty. And by the Sask Act asserting that it's exclusive domain over resources, it's again taking it right back to that question of unlawful authority of the federal crown to grant the jurisdiction over the resources. It's a complete breach of treaty. And there's no dialogue. It's a very hard line. And when you're making those assertions, and such as the Sask Trespass Act too, that has been, it was being introduced a few years ago, and it's been widely promoted. And you have Saskatchewan's own citizens, many of them not agreeing, where they've created things like the Treaty Land Sharing Network, which is land title holders wanting to give access to Indigenous people on their land, whether it's for hunting, gathering, so they can practice their traditional ways, their inherent rights to feed themselves, to gather medicines. Whenever I drive by a ditch where you might see a lot of sage, I often think we're relegated to picking our medicines in the ditch now because there's a no trespassing sign there.
Yeah. Well, Mary, we'll have to leave it there, but I wanted to say thank you, miigwech, to you for taking some time for us and speaking with us today.
Miigwech yourself. Thank you.
All right, it's time to take one final break here on the show. Another great photo of the day is next. Welcome back. It's time now for our photo of the day. From the shorelines of Ossine Lake, located in northern Manitoba, right next door to Split Lake, this photo comes from Andy Majelski. Thanks so much for sharing this great photo of the northern sunset, Andy. If you have a photo to share, be sure to send it to share@aptn.ca, and it might be our next photo of the day. All right, now let's take a look at tomorrow's weather forecast. Starting on the East Coast, to 13 in St. John's and 22 in Halifax, 14 in Cartwright and 18 in Clear and Kuujjuaq, clear and 22 in Quebec City and 24 in St. Jovite, 20 degrees in Toronto and clear and 21 in North Bay, 22 degrees in Clear and Timmins and 20 in Sioux Lookout, up in Churchill 20 degrees and 18 in Norway House, 18 and some showers in Barons River, and 22 in Winnipeg, 20 degrees in Swift Current, and 20 as well in Saskatoon, 18 degrees in Meadow Lake, and 14 in Stony Rapids. As we continue heading west, to 13 in Fort Chipewyan and 14 in Peace River, 14 in Edmonton and clear and 16 in Lethbridge, 14 degrees in Campbell River, and 13 in Bella Coola. Smithers is looking at 12 degrees and 11 in Fort Nelson, 8 degrees in Mayo and 1 in Rock River, 9 degrees in Yellowknife and 9 as well in Norman Wells, 4 degrees in Inuvik, and Colville Lakes looking at 5 degrees, 0 in Cambridge Bay and 8 in Baker Lake, -1 in Arctic Bay, and Iqaluit is looking at 3 degrees. A few lucky spectators in Victoria, British Columbia witnessed a rare visit. A pod of orcas played up to visitors near a float plane terminal in the inner harbor, gently gliding through the water. Sightings of orcas in the harbor have increased over the years, and it always manages to capture a crowd. All right, that is all we have for you this evening on APTN National News. If you want more information on any of our stories from tonight, or you're looking for more information, our website, aptnnews.ca, has that info for you. For all of us here, thank you so much for joining us. Miigwech, Kinaskamatin, and have a great evening.